Andy, can you introduce the team and the podium, please? Okay.
Yeah, very much enjoyed that. Okay, well, I guess we may as well start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this seminar. We're very pleased to introduce and welcome Dr. Ugo Pica-Ciamarra this afternoon. Ugo has been here for the last couple of days helping us out with some interviews, and we thought that while he was here we would make the most of him and ask him to let us talk about what he's doing at the moment. So Ugo is a livestock economist in the animal production and health section of the FAO in Rome, and he's been there since 2006. He's been very supportive of us in SEBI-Livestock and has been an active member of our community of practice, Livestock Data for Decision, since its inception back in 2016. His area of expertise is particularly in livestock statistics, data collection systems, public sector policies, etc. And he's current policy lead for a very large program on global health security, whose goal is to build capacity at national and local level in detecting and responding to disease outbreaks, with particular reference to zoonoses as you see, in Egypt and Uganda. He has a PhD in development economics, an MA in agricultural economics, an MS in economics and finance, which I believe he gained in Manchester, which I guess is partly responsible for his excellent English, but we'll see that in a moment. Prior to joining FAO, he worked at the University of Rome, La Sapienza, and the Italian National Institute of Agricultural Economics. So without further ado, Ugo, welcome again, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hope you can hear me. Thanks very much, Andy, for the introduction, and the entire SEBI team for organizing this seminar and giving me the opportunity to present some of the work we are doing at FAO to assist countries in implementing policies on animal health. And I'm going to share some experience from Egypt and Uganda, some preliminary results. So let me start with some takeaway messages out of this presentation. And what we believe, or at least I believe, that really, if you look at developing countries, policy implementation is perhaps the key development challenge. There's a lot of good policies there, but yet they're not implemented. And if you want to assist countries to implement policies, we should start gathering data on the capacity and constraints of policy implementers, which largely means working at local level, because at the end, policies are designed, laws are designed, formulated at the central level, but they are implemented by the local administration. Third, takeaway message is that really we need to try to develop policy solutions that are implementable with existing capacity and resources. Every one of us is good at coming up with solutions, with infinite resources, but at the end, the real challenge is to find solutions that are implementable in local context. And of course, we have solutions, but we don't know whether they work or not. So it's also important before scaling them up to pilot them on the ground. So these are my takeaway messages. And the presentation is in 5 parts, couple of slides on FAO for those who don't know the organization. Then I'll talk about the livestock policy implementation challenge. I'll touch upon the policy implementers, who is in charge of implementing policies, our experience in Egypt and Uganda, and then I'll conclude again with my takeaway messages. So for those who don't know, FAO is the specialized agency of the United Nations on Food and Agriculture, and our current mandate is largely to assist our member countries, basically all the countries of the world, to implement the Agenda 2030 to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And to this end, FAO has set internally 4 objectives that we call the 4 betters. It's better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life. And to achieve these objectives, as you can imagine, we do a variety of things, but largely I would say that FAO generates information and knowledge. For example, we maintain FAO Start, which is the largest data set on food and agriculture worldwide. We facilitate multi-stakeholder dialogue and consultation on priority areas of investment in agriculture, on emerging issues to set standards. And of course, we provide technical assistance to our member countries on a variety of policy and technical issues. And as I said, FAO is a knowledge organization, and one of the flagship annual publication of FAO is called the State and Food and Agriculture. And this publication every year targets a specific theme. And in 1982, you can see from the covers here, in 2001 and in 2009, the State of Food and Agriculture reports targeted livestock. And if you go through these publications, you can see that there's broad agreement since ever about what are the key development constraints in the livestock sector. And you can see them there. So it's poor genetics, it's poor feeding, a lot of animal diseases, limited knowledge, no access or limited access to extension services for farmers and the like. And the good news is that, FAO and other international organizations, research centers, research institutes, and produce a number of guidance documents, guidelines, good practice documents that suggest, country stakeholders, how to address those development constraints. And here you have the covers of a number of, those guidelines, and you can see we have guidelines on food security, on artificial insemination, on feeding or animal welfare and the like. Any problem you want to address, there will be some guidelines available. The second good news is that actually countries are fully aware of those livestock development constraints, and so they have developed a number of policies, programs, strategies that pass laws and regulations whose aim is really to target those development constraints. And here examples from Africa, we have the Livestock Development Strategy for Africa 2015-35 that was developed by the African Union. We have an animal health strategy of IGAD. IGAD is a regional economic community in Eastern Africa. You have the Ethiopian Master Plan and the like. So it's really a fantastic situation. We know what are the problems. We have some ideas about the solutions, and we also have agreed. The countries that prioritize addressing the problems. Yet we have a problem, and this is a graph on Africa about meat and milk per capita production in the last 40 years. And down there, you have the cover of the 3 FAO publications that target livestock, and look at what's happened in the last 40 years. Per capita milk production has increased from 35 liters per day per person to 37 to 38. And look at meat production, always a flat growth rate. So from 15 to 16 perhaps kilo per capita per year. So, good understanding of the constraints, good understanding of the solutions, great policies, and then look at what's happening on the ground, almost nothing. So what we really believe is that, one of the major challenges that we need to address is policy implementation. So everything is in place, but yet policies are not implementing. So we have, in the policy documents, prioritized the livestock development constraints and what the governments can do. On the one hand, they can pass laws and legislations that recommend, people to adopt certain good practices to address those constraints. And then, of course, there are then investments. So the government allocates some resources to address certain constraints. I mean, eventually, what the governments can do, they can allocate resources, for capital and recurrent expenditures and pass certain laws and regulations. And why it's important to implement the policy framework and not having, small projects here and there, because, the policy framework, policies shape the behavior of all of us. They have an impact countrywide. So if we manage to implement, to enforce the policy framework, we can really have an impact on the ground. A simple example, right? In the UK, you have a road safety policy, right? And then there is a law that says that the speed limit in motorways is 70 miles per hour, correct? Now, it's very easy to design that policy and, agree on the speed limit. The real challenge is to enforce that speed limit. And you can have an impact if you enforce that speed limit not in one motorway, but in all motorways of the country, so that you can really reduce, deaths and injuries. So the real challenge is not about designing, policies, passing laws, but it's about implementing them. So we ask ourselves, then if we want to implement policies, who are really the policy implementers? And at the end, all countries, as I mentioned at the beginning in this world, are really decentralized. I mean, these central governments usually design, formulate policies, laws, and regulations, but the central governments are not mandated to implement those. We have local governments that are responsible, in charge of implementing the policies and the laws and regulations, right? And I mentioned over lunch, that my country, for example, every one of us was vaccinated by the local administrations against COVID. I'm Italian, it was not Rome vaccinating me, it was my local administration. And the same happens for livestock. I mean, livestock services are not provided by the central government, but are provided by local administrations. And let me now go a bit deeper and clarify what we mean by policy implementers. And I'll make an example. I cannot make an example. It's not moving forward. Let's see. Oh, that's okay, no problem. So an example from Kenya. So in Kenya, we have a livestock set of policy. And you go through the policy, and the policy says that the national government will provide the necessary support to control animal diseases, and then the county governments, the local administrations will implement, disease surveillance, control programs, and the like. Now, how the government implements the policies, of course, there are laws and regulations. And for example, there is the Animal Diseases Act, and you go through the act, and it says that every person's in possession of a sick animal should keep such animal tied up, and you can read them the like. And it also says that administrative officers or inspectors should then ascertain the existence and nature of that disease. So you can see actually that if we think of policy implementation, we have two types of actors here. We have the private actor and you have the public actor. So policy implementation is really a common partnership between the public and the private actors. The famous governance, right, is really about a constructive partnership between the public and the private sector so that anyone can really adopt good practices. So if we think broadly, in the livestock sector, who are really the policy implementers? At the end, the policy implementers, those that should comply with the law are the farmers, the traders, the processors, the retailers, all private actors along the livestock value chain. And at the same time, we have the public officers and the frontline officers who daily collaborate, with the private actors are really the extension officers. So if we want to implement policies, we need to work with these actors. So we were asking ourselves, do these actors have resources and incentives to comply with the existing laws and regulations? And given the resources and incentives, can they suggest solutions so that eventually they can adopt good practices and comply with the existing laws and regulations. And what we have found out actually is that we really do not have data on the resources, on the capacities of local actors. And this actually is preventing us to facilitate, finding local solutions. And everybody of us know that local solutions are those that really work. So we said, how can we move forward? And now I'm presenting some of our work in Egypt and Uganda. Let me start with a problem in Egypt. Now, in Egypt, there are 21,000 small and mid-scale broiler farmers. And if you look at standard data, you can find out that they unsafely dispose about 39 million dead chicken every year. They throw this chicken on the road, in water canals, even in the Nile River, and consider, that the water used for irrigation is used also for drinking. So imagine the kind of negative public health consequences that you have from this behavior. And of course, there is a fantastic policy, there is a law that says, well, you cannot actually dump dead animals, organic material into waterways, but yet the law is not implemented. Different but similar problem in Uganda. There are about 20 million chicken meals consumed in Uganda every year, and 90%, actually 92% come from animals that have been improperly slaughtered. So, and slaughtered facilities that are not licensed, there's no antemortem and post-mortem infection. So there are really a number of public health threats for consumers. And again, the policy framework is fantastic in Uganda. We have a law that says that animals should be really inspected so that, consumers can only access good quality food. So we ask our question, how can we address, these two policy problems? I said, okay, we know that policy is implemented at local level. So let's start working in local administrations. So we are working in 2 governorates in Egypt, Menofia and Kalubia, and 2 districts in Uganda, Wakiso and Mukono. And we said, okay, can we gather information on the resources and incentives the policy implementers have at their disposal? So what we did, we sample a number of broiler farmers in Uganda, slaughterhouses in Kenya, and gather information on the business model. And then we gather information on the work environment of extension officers, the resources and incentives. I present just basic results for Egypt on the business model. What you have here is really the business model that tells us, what broiler farmers do from morning to night. Okay, what inputs they purchase, what outputs they produce, and here you have, the quantification. So it's really an enterprise budget. It's very standard economics, but this information is not typically available. And what we found out actually is that these broiler producers are really making a lot of money. They're making about $12,000 per year, which means 6 cents per bird. And what is the key information for implementing policy? The key information is that eventually these broiler producers have some resources to invest, have some capacities to contribute to policy implementation. And we did sort of the same work for Uganda slaughter facilities, poultry slaughter facilities. And then we also looked at the capacity of extension officers to provide services. And we sampled, for example, in Uganda, all extension officers working in the 2 districts where we are working. And we interviewed them on 2 major dimensions: network facilities, whether they have a computer, a mobile phone, a motorcycle, and the work environment, whether they have daily contacts with their supervisors, how do they plan their days, and the like. And I'm highlighting here some of the results which are interesting if you think of policy implementation. So in Uganda, depending on the district, 1 officer is responsible to provide services to between 2,300 and 4,600 livestock keeping households. And 1/3 of the officers use public transport to move around in rural areas. So you can see how it could be very difficult for them to provide services. And actually the local government does really not have resources, up to the point that every year in these 2 districts, the government allocated between 30 to 60 cents per livestock keeping household. So basically you can travel there, but then you cannot really provide any public good or services. And also, we also asked about the work conditions, and you can see here that, for example, only 40% suggested are good guidelines for career progressions. A lot are not satisfied with the salary, which means eventually, you know, that not only they don't have resources, but they don't even have incentives to work. So that's really, you know, the situation on the ground if we want to implement policies. So if we want to summarize the evidence that we gather, is that we have evidence of the problem, you know, the broiler farmers throwing, you know, dead birds into the Nile River, the birds that are improbably slaughtered in Uganda. We know that there's fantastic policy framework, so there's a theoretical solution, there's a law, that's the way we should behave, but it's not happening. And then we have gathered information about the capacity and the resources of the policy implementers, right? What they can do, really. And with this information, we put them into a room, right? So in Egypt and in Uganda, we had a number of consultations where we had really, you know, the extension officers and the broiler producers in Egypt, and the extension officers and the slaughter managers and the slaughterers in Uganda. And we asked them to suggest actions they could undertake to address the specific problem, and particularly actions that are implementable with the existing capacity and resources. And we feed that information to them, actually, because we had systematized, right? And of course, we also guided them with some, you know, tools, and you can see a spider chart where they were sort of, where they ranked the different actions in terms of feasibility, right? I mean, what is the cost of the action? What are the recurrence costs? You know, whether it's simple or not to be implemented? What is the impact of profit? I mean, should I do that? Do I have good incentives to do that? So that was very important for them to come up with actions that they could actually implement on the ground. Now, what has happened in Egypt and in Uganda? In Egypt, we had eventually, we are seeing two sort of behavioral changes. So broiler producers eventually agreed to compost the dead poultry, because composting is very simple. You just need the dead poultry, some litter, some water, and perhaps a compost bin. You really need a minimal investment. The dead poultry are there, the litter is there. Perhaps you just need to build this compost bin, and you can sell the composting you produce. So you have incentives to do that, right? And at the same time, extension officers agreed to provide advice not only on, you know, the technical dimension of composting, but also on the business dimensions, right? They wanted to show the value addition for the business of doing composting. And what's important here, because they have scarce resources, you know, this can be done with one-off or two trainings. You don't need to be there regularly, because composting is simple. So it is doable with existing resources. And what's happening in Egypt after, you know, 2-3 months is that, you know, right now, not a lot, but we have 26 broiler farmers who are starting doing composting for a total of 36 production cycles. And we are monitoring the situation, and their profit has increased by 1%. And the return of investment is really great, because as I said, you know, the cost of doing composting is almost zero, because the dead birds is there, the litter is there. Now you can say, well, this is really a minor result. But I think what is very important is that first, we have not provided any financial resources to the government of Egypt or to the broiler producers to change their behavior. And this solution for exactly this region is then potentially scalable, because it's feasible with existing resources and capacity, and so we can really have an impact at scale. What's the story now for Uganda? Again, we see in Uganda two behavioral changes. So the slaughter facilities agreed to adopt a core set of biosecurity practices, provided they can be certified. And their idea is that if I'm certified, they can expand my client bases and increase my profit. And they, you know, they agreed together with the extension officers, with the local veterinary authorities, to 29 basic biosecurity practices. They need to keep separate the clean and dirty area of the slaughter facilities. They need to use disinfectants. They need to use bleeding cones. So very simple, you know, things. And the field animal health officers agreed no longer to act as enforcers, but as enablers. So they don't go there ready to issue a fine and penalize, you know, the slaughter facilities if they're not complying with the law, but they're going there to suggest options, you know, for improvement, to adopt good practices. And after 3 months, we are monitoring, the results. This is what's happening. I mean, we're actually working in 9 slaughter facilities in 2 districts, which are about 80% of all the poultry slaughter facilities. And what you can see here is that the compliance with the 29 biosecurity practices, and on average, in here at baseline, they were complying just with 28% of the practices, and today we are at 69%. So again, we can see some improvement. And as I said, it's something minor, but FAO did not provide any resources, to achieve this change, and this solution, this potential is scalable countrywide. So it's feasible with existing resources and capacity, and we can have an impact at scale. Now, these are really preliminary results. These pilots are ongoing, and we're also implementing similar activities in Ethiopia, Kenya, Cambodia, and Uganda. And we are trying to document the process. This is one example, and evaluating the results. And our objective perhaps is to develop, other guidelines on livestock policy implementation. And in those guidelines, there will be at least 2 sections on data gathering. This is for SEBI, one really on gathering information on the economics of farmers, of traders, livestock stakeholders, and the other on the capacity of local governments to provide public goods and services. And I'm going back to my takeaway messages. So really, I believe the policy implementation is the key challenge that we need to address. In developing countries, what we need to fix are the basics. We don't need to hard science, but sometimes, it's really about, washing your hands before entering the slaughter facilities. We need to gather data on the capacity and constraints of the policy implementers, which unfortunately we disregard because we collect, really data at the high level, that are representative of the country, but at the end, decisions are taken at local level. So we need to provide information to the local administrations. We need to develop policy solutions that possibly are implemented both with existing capacity and resources. They're not perfect, absolutely, but certainly they represent the progress with respect to the starting situation. And finally, and this is what we're doing, before suggesting that the solutions that you can come up with are great, better you pilot them and assess their effectiveness. And that's all for today. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ugo.
Should I stay here? I don't know how it works.
Yes, please, for a moment. Thanks
No,
very much.
filming, so.
Thanks very much indeed for that fascinating talk. I'd like to open the meeting for discussion. Anybody, any comments or questions, please? Francis, we'll just get the mic to you.
Hello. Oh, thank you, Ugo. Got kind of 2 questions in my head. The first one is in terms of the compost and the poultry. Could you tell us more about the managing disease and pathogens in that kind of process? And then the second one is more, do you see in your head, you mentioned there was other pilots at the end, maybe projects that could easily make a contribution quickly on the ground to reducing kind of greenhouse gas emissions, for example?
Yeah. Should I take this question? Yes. Okay, for this question, actually, we are working with, I'm not a vet, I'm on comments. Anyway, we're working with the lab in Egypt, and they made analysis on the compost, and the compost is free of pathogens. The one that we produce, and it's also good quality with respect to the chemical fertilizer that you can purchase on the markets. So that's the first. Second question is about whether I see, is that quick wins? Well, I really don't know. Well, I think there are plenty of small things that can be done on the ground, but perhaps we are focusing too much on the big pictures rather than, on the small things that can be done. You think of greenhouse gas emission, you're thinking of Africa. Africa, livestock contributes 6% to the total greenhouse gas emission from livestock. Okay. And yet we are making really a lot of investments to improve the efficiency of livestock production systems in the hope they're going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But I mean, back on the envelope calculation can tell you that if we kill overnight all the livestock in Africa, we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emission by less than 1% worldwide. So my point is really, we need to be a bit more practical in what we do and context specific. Hope I answered to some extent your question.
Joanna.
Thank you, that was a good talk. I feel like there's a tension between having a policy that's shiny and ideal and kind of best practices versus something that's practical and achievable. How would you recommend that governments would deal with that? Is there a certain time frame that they should revisit their policies and refresh based on what's been achieved, or is it just individual countries and individual policies?
Well, a policy document is there forever, right? I mean, in Europe, we have the common agricultural policy. It dates back to 1962. It's still in place because what a policy does is it spells out the vision, where you want to go, right? And then, of course, you need to have laws, regulations that assist you getting there. So I think there's no any conflict. I mean, it's not that you have a policy and should be achieved overnight, right? The policy is really your vision about having a sustainable livestock, or environmental friendly livestock. And then, of course, you need to have laws and regulations that assist you achieving that vision. Where there is a conflict sometimes is that, there are a number of international standards, for example, of animal health. And what happens is that often developing countries legislate those standards. And these create tensions because, you cannot, take one developing country and overnight ensure, that is complying with international standards. And this created a very difficult situation because sometimes, you have, when you want to assist countries is using a sort of a progressive approach, because that's what you should be doing. Say, well, we cannot do that because it's going against the law, because the law says that tomorrow morning, all poultry should be inspected. So that's a bit where you have a tension. And I think it's a bit naive sometimes, that countries are really legislating international standards that should be considered as really your long-term objective, is not what you should do on the ground tomorrow.
Vanessa, I think you have something online.
There's two questions in the chat. I'll start with the first one. So the question comes from Tanmian, and it's, can I ask who is buying the compost from dead poultry in the Egypt example, and is that demand sustainable? Is it going to continue?
Yes, the answer is that there is a major market for fertilizer in Egypt, and the Egypt government right now is subsidizing fertilizer production. And in spite of this subsidies, there's also a black market, which means, that the farmers, purchase the subsidized fertilizer and then sell it at a higher price. So the market is there. I mean, we did some analysis, and actually we hope that because of that, this program can be sort of taken up really by the government, because they can actually save a lot by avoiding subsidizing fertilizer production.
The second question, this is from Paul Bethel. The objectives of policymakers and producers are not always aligned. Your example was that of total milk and meat production, but many farmers measure success by the size of the herd, not by milk or meat production. So how can policymakers deal with misalignment?
I guess it's referring to pastoral people, right? And we're talking about herd. Well, I don't know. No, to be honest, what I can say is actually, I mean, the policy should be aligned. You have the personal objectives, right, of a farmer or a family, and then you have some social objectives, and and the capacity of policymakers should actually, to find the right compromise to some extent, so that at the end you can ensure some good practices that are adopted, even by those who are not willing, to increase production or productivity or whatever. Sorry, I don't really have a good answer to that question.
Anyone else? Yes. Right at the back, please.
Oh, yes. I'm trying to speak up. Oh, thanks.
Hello. Yeah, I was just wondering, how would you say gender differences within kind of small stock producers would impact policy implementation, for example, for other animals such as like pigs? How would you say that would kind of get in the way for policy implementation? Or would it benefit cultural norms?
Well, I think we have not done that, but I mean, I think that of course, we should also look, at the gender dimension in all the interventions that one does. For example, we have not even looked at the environmental dimension to some extent. There are multiple dimensions that on paper one should look at. What I can say, if I can be a bit provocative, is that I believe that the sustainable development goals are making development much more difficult for developing countries, right? Because all of a sudden we should start, keeping into consideration all these dimensions, which is fair enough, right? But we didn't do that here in the industrialized world, and now we're asking them to do, which is okay, but they need assistance, but to look at all these dimensions when you do any kind of investment, you need to look at public health, you need to look at environment and gender and the youth, and food quality is really, really very challenging. It's something that one can try to inject, but I always see a trade-off, between doing things rather than, researching to some extent and then being practical.
And that's also at the back.
Hi, I'd like to ask, how did you try to tackle some of those challenges that you want when you gather the data from the industry or the implementers? For example, maybe the survey response rates are low, or sometimes it might be difficult to find information on the business model, etc. So
Yeah.
how would you tackle it?
Okay, that's a very good question. I mean, we didn't simply, what we did, in the local districts in which we are working, we set up a sort of a coalition for change, right? So our idea was really to ensure that, everyone was on board at the very beginning. And the objective was, we want to increase, poultry production and productivity, and this is going to benefit everyone. So eventually, the private actors were really willing to share their information. And we did actually work with some business schools to gather that information because it's not our area of expertise. And we had a number of focus group discussions, for example, on the budget, as you can imagine, because people are not always willing to give you the right numbers. And then we validated them. We validated the data with some specific with surveys on specific farmers. So that's a good point. But the idea was really at the very beginning to ensure that everyone was on board and understand what was our objective of a sort of a common journey with the stakeholders.
Another one from Vanessa, please. Come on, Marie.
Thanks. This is another online question from Kelly Watson. In many African countries, a substantial proportion of chickens is sold by a live bird market. How do we align this with slaughterhouse policy, and should we?
With
slaughterhouse policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it depends on the countries. That's true. I mean, for example, what we're doing in Kenya, we are actually assisting farmers in slaughtering properly birds on the farm. And you can do the same, I would say, also in live bird markets. At the end, these slaughter facilities where we work, as slaughter facilities that are on the markets, typically what people do, they purchase a bird and then they go to the local slaughter facilities to have the bird slaughtered. So I think, you can use the same approach to address sort of any kind of problem. So some, I'd say, problems on the ground.
So in developing countries, the poultry are managed by a small group of farmers, like having few birds, and also the backyard poultry farming, and also the industry are working. So how would you when you implement any strategy, how will you coordinate in between? Because the backyard poultry farm, probably they will not aligned with the governments probably, and there will be a lot of discrepancy in between the different level of the farmers. How would you really ensure that the this policy will implement at all different stages of the local community?
Yes. Well, if you think at how policies are implemented, they are implemented differently in every district, in every region, right? The way extension services are provided in pastoral areas is certainly different from the way they are provided in peri-urban areas, right? So if you think that policies are decentralized, then the policy implementation mechanisms will be different and tailored to local conditions. So you don't need to think of the policy as a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, but that could be the policy design, and you want to ensure that all poultry assembly is loaded. But then the mechanism to which that policy is implemented can be varied, and it depends on the local circumstances. So if you think at implementation through a decentralized approach, then you can have different ways of implementing the policies.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sure.
I have another question. This problem of implementation of policies is not common. So I remember a really nice quote from Nigeria where we have beautiful animal health policies, absolutely, as many policies as you can imagine, but implementing them impossible.
Yeah.
What advice would you have to give to donors or funders, people who are funding, trying to assist the government in implementing these policies as to where to start? How do they get that information on where implementation is at these local levels, because the implementation is so varied and so local? How do they get information on what to assist with?
Two answers to this good question. The first one is that I think we should start really working in improving the system of administrative data collection. So local records, right? We just tend to work with the statistical authorities, which implement, surveys or census, but we don't work with the local administrations that yet gather data on a daily basis on the service that they are delivering. So we need really to try to improve administrative records. In terms of donors, what I think we have a culture of sort of central planning, and designing a policy or a law is very simple. They give us, $100,000 US. We call up a meeting, we look at the policy of a country, another, and in 2 months we can draft the policy, and then we have it approved by the parliament, then we make a big show. And you can deliver on that, no problem. But then when I tell you, can you reform the system of veterinary services for the same amount of money? You don't know what to do, right? And central planning does not work. You need to have a risk-prone approach. And unfortunately, the donors do not have a risk-prone approach. And I can also understand, because at the end, they are accountable to the taxpayers, right? You cannot go back to the Congress and say, we tried the 3 things in Nigeria, we completely failed. Right? We say, instead say, well, we developed the 1 health strategy in Nigeria, and hey, we're not happy. So everyone, I don't know, but you see the trade-off, right? Between sort of spending money where you can be easily monitor whether things are working or not, rather than taking a sort of risk-prone approach and you're not very sure whether things are working or not. Yet my point is that if you start piloting, dozens, let's say, of things, then 2 or 3 will really succeed, and the returns of the investment will be great. But you need to change a bit the attitude that we have on this.
Yeah, I wondered if I could ask something. I was very struck by your comment about the animal health officer role, kind of switching from being enforcers to enablers, particularly in the Ugandan situation, I think. How important is that in the overall context of what you're trying to do?
I think that's really a fundamental shift. And because, eventually they see themselves no longer as, really the enforcers who should be there, to ensure that the law is complied with, but they're starting developing a partnership. And when we had some meetings in Kenya also about this, it was great to see that Particularly the extension officers said, what has really changed is our relationship with the farmers. That they no longer see us as an enemy, right, but as a partner. If we can change that relationship, I think we can really make good progress. And this relationship has partly changed because we took a sort of business perspective. So the role of the extension officers is not only, to tell technically to the farmer what to do, but to assist him what to do to improve. And actually what's happened in Uganda, you saw that progress, right? They went at baseline and then they agreed on a work plan for the next month. Then they went month one, they gathered the data, say, this is where we stand, what we can do next. And they agreed with the extension officers on another work plan. And I don't know how that can be achieved, but that was really a trigger, to be honest, that facilitated some achievements.
Yeah. And forgive me if I asked this question out of ignorance because I don't know enough about your program, but it seems to me there might be a role for the social sciences in some of this work. Is that the case, or do you not have that?
Yes, we have. Yes, we have. We are social scientists working with vets. Just few of us working with a lot of veterinary.
But you've emphasised the fact that these are businesses, and that's absolutely true. They're private sector, they're small farmers, so they want to see the economic benefits. That's their motivation.
Absolutely.
But there are obviously also, so it's not just economics, it's socio-economics. I just wanted to.
No. There's also that dimension on food security, poverty reduction, you see, gender empowerment, women empowerment. Yes, we're not capturing that dimension, but it's there.
Anything else? Christian?
We just have to quick question about if you forecast that figure that you showed about the increased milk the increased milk or increased leach that didn't happen over the last couple of 3 years. Is it going to change in the next month?
Well, let's say if you look at the business as usual scenario, today we have about 350 million cattle in Africa. And the projections say that there will be 350 million today. There will be 700 million in 2050. So whether this is going to change so we can actually increase productivity and reduce the number of animals, I think it depends very much on the extent to which we are able to implement policies. That's really my point. Otherwise, Africa population is going to double in the next 30 years. Most of the demand will be satisfied of animal products by increased herd size. And this is going to be a real problem for, resource utilization.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. I think I'm going to draw it to a close. I hope you'll join me in thanking Ugo for a fascinating presentation. But before you do, I just wanted to give my own special thanks to Ugo for coming and helping us yesterday, but also giving your talk. And I've got a small gift for you here, something to put your limoncello in a cold winter evening.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thanks very much.